Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's episode 2560 of The Tom Woods Show. We've got Michael Huemer with us, who is the author of numerous books, one of which I genuinely believe in our tradition of thought is one of the best, most convincing, most important books of the past quarter century, and that is The Problem of Political Authority. Even though it has I can't prove this. I have the author here, and perhaps he can. There it is. You can see it on your screen. Maybe he can confirm this theory of mine that he gave it a dry academic title to sneak it by the various philosophy departments so they wouldn't realize what he was up to in this book, because it's an extremely radical book. But the book we're going to be talking about today is his brand new book, Progressive Myths. And I believe, Mike, there is no subtitle to this book. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
You're defying all modern convention here?
Yeah. Tired of subtitles. Yeah.
I mean, look, this is all you need. Right? That's all you need. Progressive myths. So I want to go into some of these progressive myths because they're very widespread, but they are the kinds of things that a person who, let's say, doesn't devote a lot of time to thinking about important issues might be led into believing, because it's not just quote unquote progressives who believe these kinds of things. It's just the mainstream outlets somebody might consult to get information about the world. And you may say, well, those people are progressives. Well, fair enough. But I think I could imagine, it's conceivable to me that a well-meaning person could be misled on a bunch of the issues you talked about here. Now, why is it, I would tend to think of you as the kind of libertarian who would say that he is neither left nor right, that libertarianism is a separate thing altogether. And yet, you wrote a book called Progressive Myths, and you didn't write a book called Conservative Myths. Now, why is that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a few reasons. One is, you can only do so many things, like
okay.
Limited time, and, I didn't want the book to be too big. And another thing is so I could list false beliefs that conservatives commonly have. They don't really strike me the same way as myths, like, 2020 election was stolen. Okay. Or, global warming is a hoax. They're not exactly myths. Like, they're not really things that are going around in the culture that most people would think are like the objective facts or something like that. They're not being picked up by the news media. They're not being taught in classes and things like that. And then, another thing is I am particularly troubled by, there's kind of like a theme in the progressive myths. It's not just like a bunch of random errors. They're like, there's a theme of attacking America. And America's a great society. We should not be tearing it down. We should not, and not just because I love America, but because, you start undermining trust in your institutions and trust in the fundamental values of your society. And where is that going? That is not going anywhere good, and like, there's a lot of this, it's sort of like a lot of the myths are oriented towards convincing you that America is unjust fundamentally and evil and stuff like that. And some of the conservative stuff is like that, like the stuff about the election, but a lot of it is just like, no, they just don't like what the leftists are.
It is no doubt true that these myths, as you say, aren't just random, but that taken together, they are an indictment of the United States as a society. But then the United States, in turn, is a stand-in for still other things, like the free market economy, for example, which people associate with the United States. So it's not even just America. It's whole ways of organizing economies. It's whole ways of organizing societies that are being challenged and that are presumed to come up short against, well, they are sometimes not that specific in what exactly they want to replace it with, but it's not too difficult to imagine what the opposite of what we have now would look like. So the way you've organized your book is, of course, obviously you run through a bunch of the myths, but you start off in part one by reminding us of some stories, not of general principles, but of the stories of the travails of particular well-known individuals, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, etc., Kyle Rittenhouse. Because these individual stories, what's happened with them is that not only were they, I think, misleadingly portrayed in the media, but since at this point, I think a lot of Americans have kind of made up their minds about what American society is like and what it's all about. And so when they hear a story of a Trayvon Martin, they almost don't need the details. They know how to plug it into their pre-existing understanding of the world. And the problem is that the way the facts behind these stories don't actually tell the story that progressives think they tell. And you are at pains to point out, this is not to say that there are never injustices in the U.S. or that there are never injustices perpetrated by the police. That's a separate matter. We don't deny that. I mean, they are government employees after all, with all the bad incentives that they face. But I'd like to just take a couple of those individual cases, if we could, and recount maybe what people think they know about them and what they ought to know about them. So can you recall for us the Michael Brown incident?
Yeah. So Michael Brown was a black man who was shot. Now I've forgotten when this was, but several years ago by a white cop named Darren Wilson. And the story that people were telling, that the left-wing activists were telling, was that Michael Brown had surrendered to the police. That he held his hands up and said, "Don't shoot," and then the cop gunned him down anyway because he's a racist bastard. Right? That's the political activist story. It just turned out that the evidence did not support that at all, and that story was basically a lie made up by Michael Brown's friend. Okay, so Michael Brown was with a friend, walking down the street when this cop passes them by and says, "Hey, get out of the street, walk on the sidewalk," or something. And they basically refuse to do that. And then he pulls the car in front of them. And then there's some kind of altercation between Michael Brown and the cop, in which, the friend story, we don't have Michael Brown's story because he's dead, but the friend's story was that the cop attacked Michael Brown and grabbed him by the neck and tried to pull him towards the car, and they were having a struggle. Okay, and you should see the implausibility of this story is just from the start of it, right? Michael Brown outweighs the cop by 50 pounds, and the cop is going to reach out with his left hand and grab him so he's sitting in the car. He's going to reach out and grab a guy who's standing outside the car and pull him down. They're going to have a struggle like that. And why would he do that anyway? So, what appears to have actually happened is that Michael Brown punched the cop in the face, and then he's punching the cop, and then the cop goes for his gun, and then Michael Brown tries to grab the gun and shoot the cop with his own gun. So that's the point at which the cop shoots at him, and the bullet goes through the door of the car, and then Brown runs down the street. Okay, and then the cop follows him, and then Michael Brown turns around and charges towards the cop, and that's when the cop shoots again. Okay, and then so one of the bullets hit him in the head and killed him. Okay, and we know this partly from forensic evidence. It's all of the forensic evidence is consistent with the cop's story, and it doesn't fit with, the friend's story at all.
So, of course, this is not just a story of something that happened to somebody. This, of course, became emblematic of the injustice of American society, right? And but then we have the on the other side, we have somebody like Kyle Rittenhouse, who does not get favorable treatment in the press, and about whom people believe a variety of different kinds of falsehoods. So how would you describe what happened in the Kyle Rittenhouse case?
Yeah. It's just the treatment of these characters in these news stories is very different depending upon the color of their skin, right? So the news media was extremely unsympathetic to Kyle Rittenhouse. There are all these journalists talking about the case saying, and he crossed state lines, like apparently shocked that he crossed state lines, and they're trying to make it sound like that's some kind of crime, right? Maybe they thought it was a crime to drive across a state border in the United States. It's not a crime anyway. Yeah, so there's like all these quotes from these people saying how this was obviously a murder, and then people were outraged by the verdict when Rittenhouse was acquitted, right? It's like as a side point, like the verdict in a trial is usually based upon the evidence, because the jurors actually have to sit there and listen to all of the evidence on both sides, which is not true of pundits on TV. And so when the pundit on TV disagrees with the jury, the pundit is usually wrong, right? That's because the pundit they don't have to listen to anything. They can just look at the color of the guy's skin and decide that he's a racist murderer. But by the way, it was also bizarre that a bunch of people were saying like this showed this was like a triumph for white supremacy. It showed all the racism in America, and you're like, what are they talking about? Like, so a white guy shot 3 other white guys. What does this have to do with race? Like, how does this show racism? What are you guys talking about? Some people got the impression that Rittenhouse must have shot black people just because of the way the news media was talking about it. Right? Anyway, that was just like the evidence in the case. It was just like it was all on Rittenhouse's side. There was no basis for filing charges against him. It was just political.
Yeah, and I remember that the judge who was, who seemed sympathetic to what he was saying was in turn condemned and ridiculed. It couldn't be that maybe somebody looked at the evidence and saw something different from what you saw when you didn't look at the evidence.
What you saw when you looked at Twitter.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Are you on Twitter?
No.
Okay.
But I have an account that I never use. So
okay. I was wondering, because I was going to say, I don't think I've seen you comment on there. Maybe good for your mental health. I don't know. I have to be on there. Cool. Given my crazy living, I have to be on there. But so now, having talked about these couple of cases, I want to move on to now from these individuals to stories that we would tell in terms of statistics. And I want to make sure everybody understands that I don't say that if there are not as many injustices as we thought, that doesn't mean that I'm excusing the existing ones. And for some reason, I'm recalling back when I used to teach history to freshmen, there was one year I had an avowed Marxist-Leninist in the room. But I thought it was interesting. It made it interesting. We had interesting banter. And so we got to the Bolshevik Revolution. And the several years after that Lenin was still alive. And I mentioned that by the time of Lenin's death, there were something like 70,000 people in camps. And his response to that was twofold. One, that's not that many. And two, well, they deserve, what are these people, bourgeois? Like, they probably deserved it. I mean, I'm not kidding you. Now, nobody else in the class knew what bourgeois meant, so they thought he was actually making an argument instead of justifying mass kidnapping. But I thought I'm never, ever going to be the kind of person who says, oh, look, it was only 70,000. I'm never going to be that person. So anyway, with that out of the way, you shared, I don't expect you to remember the numbers, but just qualitatively, you shared some survey results from Skeptic magazine from several years ago, and in which people were asked how many unarmed black men did they think police had killed in 2019, and then they were also asked if you had to hazard a guess, what percentage of people in that year killed by police were black. What did that study tell us? What did it find about people's views on this?
Yeah. They were drastically overestimating, right? Like, large numbers of people thought that 1,000 or more unarmed black people were shot by police. And they asked about a particular year, okay? So the actual statistic from that year was 36. So they thought it was over 1,000, it was 36. And also that the misconceptions were stronger if you were on the left. So people who describe themselves as liberal or very liberal had bigger overestimates, right? And then they thought like some huge portion of the people who were shot were black. It's like, much, much larger than it actually was. Right? Oh, also it was correlated with trust in the media. Like if they also asked, how do you feel about the media? Like trust them a lot or little. People who trust the media more had bigger misconceptions. Right? Which, makes sense if you've seen these stories.
Folks, I'm going to be blunt. A big part of why I get as much done as I do is my impatience with fluff in all areas of my life. My approach is get to the point. I want my books to do the same thing. Just tell me what you need to tell me. And that's exactly what the Blinkist app does for thousands of nonfiction books in 27 different categories. No fluff, just the heart of the matter. You can absorb the Blinkist summary in just 15 minutes of reading or listening. What a time to be alive. A commute of 30 minutes each way, you can absorb the equivalent of 4 books. Among the thousands and thousands of titles at Blinkist, you'll find libertarian classics, too, by Murray Rothbard, Milton Friedman, and a title even by your host here, Ol Woods. Well, right now, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Go to Blinkist.com/Woods to start your 7-day free trial and get 40% off a Blinkist premium membership. That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist, Blinkist.com/Woods to get 40% off and a 7-day free trial. Blinkist.com/Woods. And now for a limited time, you can even use Blinkist Connect to share your premium account. You'll get 2 premium subscriptions for the price of 1. Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I know at some point, it was in a private letter, but Thomas Jefferson said at one point that really, you would be better off reading no newspaper at all than reading the newspapers of his day, because at least you'd have a blank slate in your head. You wouldn't be prejudiced in favor of falsehoods right off the bat. So we know about those. And I've heard that too. I've heard that depending on that, people's estimate of what the number is seems to run pretty closely with where they are on the political spectrum. But you shared in this section a study I had not known about before, but that I found very interesting. And I guess it's the Lois James study from 2016, which has to do with police behavior and particularly with regard to race. Now, can you tell us what that was all about?
Okay, so this is the one where they did the simulations, right?
Yeah.
So they wanted to find out if the cops are biased towards shooting black people, or they're or maybe they're biased the other way. I don't know, right? So they did this experiment where they put the cops in simulators, and these simulators are used during police training, by the way. So they're considered the best way of preparing cops for real situations. So there's they make like a film where there are actors pretending to be potential suspects, and then the suspects do something, and the cop has to decide what to do in response, right? Like sometimes they pull a gun out, or sometimes the person in the film pulls out a wallet. Okay, and the cop has to decide what to do, like do they shoot or not? Okay, and then they prepared these scenarios. They prepared 2 versions of each scenario, one with a black actor and one with a white actor. So you could see whether they're more likely to shoot the black people. And what turned out is they're more likely to shoot white people in the same scenario. Okay, so it takes them longer to decide to shoot a black person. It's 0.2 seconds longer, so it's just a little bit. That's enough for it to be an unconscious bias. It's not really enough for it to be a conscious bias. And also they made more mistakes. They mistakenly shot white people like 14% of the time. They only mistakenly shot black people 1% of the time. Okay, and so if the statistics were reversed, that progressives would be touting this as proof of how racist the police are. Looks like the evidence shows that they're biased in the other direction from what we thought.
And that's so surprising, and yet it's so often the case that the reality is the opposite of what's drilled into our heads, because the opposite of this is drilled into our heads all the time. And it's interesting to see how often it is that when you look more closely, you find something quite different. I don't want to spend all our time on issues related to race in particular, because there are so many topics you cover here. But there is one more thing I would like to hit on, and that is in your chapter 8. And you begin with it, because your format is you state the myth and then you address it. So here's how you state this particular myth. Psychology has proved that most people have implicit racist attitudes that cause them to unfairly discriminate. These biases can be addressed through implicit bias training. Now, we do hear that a lot because that's implicit in the idea that we do see in some DEI circles, quote unquote, anti-racist circles, that white people at least are inherently racist. And now, whether they can be addressed through bias training, some of these anti-racist people are not so sure of that you're just racist, there's nothing you can do. However, we do want you to come to our $300 seminar, so we do have to hold out some prospect that you can be reformed. So what's the truth of this?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so one of the things is, well, there's just no evidence this training does anything. Right. So, so it comes from this test that they have in psychology and social psychology called the implicit association test. Sometimes misdescribed as the implicit attitude test. Okay. But it's essentially a reaction time test to determine whether you have like biases towards or against a particular group or a particular thing. It can be done with a huge range of things, right? But of a particular interest, it could be done to see if you have implicit positive associations with a certain race or negative associations. Right? Basically, like it takes you a little bit longer to form positive associations with Black people than with white people, and then people say that shows that you have implicit racist attitudes. Now, interestingly, it turns out if you do the same kind of test, you also show that people have implicit biases against men and in favor of women. But you basically never hear that. It's like the people who tout this test don't talk about that, right? But okay, so it's asserted that this shows racism, that this would have something to do with actually biased behavior. But we don't actually know that. And it's been disputed, like there are other possible explanations. Okay, like, so there's one article in the literature that proposes that, well, maybe the reaction time differences just detect whether you think there are negative associations in the culture with that person, like, right? And so with a particular group or whatever, rather than detecting whether you personally have negative associations. Okay, but anyway, then they tried to find connections between the implicit association test and actual prejudice behavior. They're just like not able to find actual behavioral consequences of this, right? And then they're also, and you can change your result on the implicit association test. Like you can be trained to do better on the action time tests, but there's no evidence that has any actual benefit, right? Like that will actually modify your behavior in any positive way, right? The other thing is like results on the implicit association test are not even reliable. And reliable is a technical term in social science, so it means they're not strongly correlated with each other. So if you take the test on one day and then you take the test on another day, your scores in the 2 days widely vary, right? Which means that this test isn't really testing a stable characteristic, right? So it's something that fluctuates wildly from day to day. So like, why is this interesting?
What is your opinion, just as a human being, about the claim that we have a natural tendency to show bias against those who are in some way unlike ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, that's plausible. You could think of examples, and especially in history, you could think of examples where it's happened a lot. It seems like we're at this point in our history, we developed a society where there's a lot less bias. This has got to be one of the least biased societies in history, right? I don't completely know how we did this, right? But that appears to be the case. There's probably still some bias left.
But I wonder, maybe it comes from the way we lived a long time ago and let's say tribal existence, and you have to make a quick judgment about somebody on the basis of no information at all. The only information I have is you don't look like me. And I know I can trust the people who look like me.
You're seeing this stranger for the first time, right? First time you ever see them, and you have to react because they may be about to kill you. Right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. As a matter of fact, I mean, in history, if you go back to pre-civilized times, there's like a huge amount of violence between tribes. So it was actually rational to think that that person might be about to kill you, because often they were, and you might want to kill them, right? Because people back then were more violent. So we might have instincts of suspicion towards people who are, from the out group, right? Not in our group.
Now, I said I didn't want to spend all the time on race, and I don't. But there is one more quick thing, and then I want to talk about some feminist ideas. But the thing involving the quote unquote stereotype threat, that the existence of stereotypes that people who are being stereotyped are aware of, has a tendency to suppress their level of achievement, presumably because it undermines their self-confidence, I assume?
Yeah. So the theory is the test taker's awareness of stereotypes about their group and then being reminded of their group membership, it causes a certain amount of stress in them. They become anxious about possibly confirming the stereotype. And then that anxiety and sort of distraction causes them to perform worse until they wind up confirming stereotype. Okay. And there are a bunch of people who are under the impression that this might explain the entire test score gap between blacks and whites. And that comes from a misleading graph that appeared in the original study on stereotype threat. And, so the graph appears to show one condition in which the black and white students are performing the same and another condition in which the white students perform much better. Okay, but as explained in the article, the condition where they're performing about the same does not actually mean that they're performing the same. Rather, the study authors essentially gave a handicap to the black students. Right? So they adjusted their scores on the test that they were taking in the lab according to the students' initial SAT scores. And so when they look the same, what that means is they're doing about the same relative to their SAT scores. Right? The black students have lower SAT scores. And so if they perform worse on the test in the lab by the same amount that they underperformed on the SAT, then they come out looking the same as the whites. Okay. So anyway, the important thing here, I think, is people tried to see whether this phenomenon, the stereotype threat, makes a difference in real assessments, like when somebody takes the SAT or the achievement test, like for college. And the studies that more closely replicate the actual test conditions, including studies that were done on actual administrations of these standardized tests. Like, they give you the AP calculus exam or something like this, and then they actually do variations in which they remind you of your race before or after you finish the test. They find no effect, right? Or there's either a greatly reduced effect or actually no effect, right? So it appears that this phenomenon does not, in fact, explain the test score gaps.
Folks, there's a lot of talk these days about how expensive groceries are. You go to the grocery store and you wonder, how are ordinary people doing this? But I'm saying the same thing about health insurance. Remember how that was supposed to get more inexpensive? It was supposed to become affordable, as in Affordable Care Act. And that's not happening either. American health insurance is frustrating and expensive. Claims denials are becoming more common. The Affordable Care Act probably didn't make your care more affordable. Well, that's why Crowd Health was created. It's not health insurance. It's a better way to pay for health care through crowdfunding. Because let's face it, your insurance policy is opaque and full of unpleasant surprises, and your premiums are going up year after year. Well, Crowd Health is doing things differently. For $175 for an individual or $575 for a family of 4 or more, you'll get access to a community of people who are willing to help out in the event of an emergency. You'll get access to telemedicine visits, discounted prescriptions, and so much more without doctors' networks getting in the way. Let Crowd Health help with your healthcare needs. Get started today for just $99 per month for your first 3 months. Go to joincrowdhealth.com/woods. Crowd Health is not insurance. Learn more at joincrowdhealth.com/woods. That's joincrowdhealth.com/woods. The differences that we see are very widespread. Like no matter how progressive the school district is, they can't seem to get rid of this several grade level difference between white and black students. And they've tried everything. They really have tried everything. And surely there are districts that have gone out of their way, at least locally, to try to undermine the the various negative stereotypes. You would think they would have slightly better results, but I don't know that there's evidence of that.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, in fact, if it was true that stereotype threat is the explanation for the difference, we would have fixed it.
Yeah.
Like if you could just not ask people their race, and then that would drastically increase their scores, we'd be doing that.
Yeah, no kidding. No, certainly we would. All right, let's move on. I've talked numerous times about the gender pay gap, so I feel like I've addressed it here. But yet, if ever there were a misconception that should have been embarrassed into oblivion by now, but yet persists anyway, it's this gender pay gap. And you give numerous reasons to believe that the explanation for the difference in earnings between men and women is entirely benign, and that when you control for certain factors, you can even get rid of a whole lot of it, but that it's not a matter of, well, businesses just like men better than women or something like that, because you'd always get a business who just likes profits better than men, and they would just hire all women. So it should be obvious that these businesses can't be both money-grubbing, profit-seeking pigs and also chauvinist pigs. Like they got to be one or the other, and yet they somehow want them to be both. That doesn't quite work. But what would be the way you would persuade somebody? And by the way, I will say the key words here are the words "for doing the same work."
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's not what they're looking at aggregates. Men earn this, women earn that. But why would those things be the same work? All right, anyway, I'm giving away half the answer. You talk.
Yeah. So, the most recent version of the statistic, you hear different versions of it. It used to be that women get paid 59 cents for every dollar that men earn. That was like decades ago.
Long time ago,
now it's up to 82 cents. And many people assume that means they get paid less for the same work. Right. And you can get quotes from all these people like, activists and politicians saying we need women to be paid the same for the same work. Okay. But actually the 82 cents does not refer to the same work. It overwhelmingly refers to different work. And women are getting paid less for doing different jobs, i.e. men are taking up the higher paying jobs, right? Or they're doing the stuff within the job that gets you higher pay, right? Like, you work longer hours, or you're willing to work on weekends, or if you're willing to relocate for the company, then you get paid more money. There are all these sacrifices that you can make that sort of make your life a little bit worse but get you more money. And the men are more likely to do that. And that's why they're getting paid more money. Right. So, one interesting thing is if you just look at never married people with no children who are working full time, women get paid 18% more than men. So it actually might be that there's a reverse pay gap. It might be that there's actually bias in favor of women. And then, you wonder what about this thing? Like they're capitalists. Why would they be overpaying women? Right. Because that's not profitable either. Right. But the thing is, in the case of female employees, there's a risk of being sued for underpaying them. It's extremely unlikely that you'd be sued by a male or that they would win for gender discrimination pay. So it actually does make sense to slightly overpay the women from a business standpoint to end off lawsuits. There's also the fact that, most people like women more than they like men. That's come out in psychological studies. That's not just my right. So, that could cause a little bit of bias.
The factor that I find interesting is that we're supposedly comparing apples to apples because we're comparing full-time workers, women full-time workers, male full-time workers. That's still not entirely apples to apples because there's a lot to disaggregate there. But the thing is, the definition of full-time usually means 35 hours and up. And so women are more likely to work 35 to 39 hours, whereas men are more likely, than women are, to work 40 to 44 or more than that. And so that's not factored in. And so when you factor that in, you actually wind up, with getting up to 88 cents on the dollar. So just that one obvious correction that needs to be made takes it to 88. And I'm quite fond of pointing out that there was a moment during the Obama administration in which it was discovered that the Obama White House was paying women 88 cents for every dollar they paid to men. And this came up in a press conference. You can believe somebody actually asked them a challenging question. I mean, how do you account for this? And the answer was, well, men and women do different things at the Obama White House. Like, they couldn't believe they were being asked this. Yeah. Yes, I know. That's what we've been saying.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of these quotes about the pay gap was from Obama, I think, about how we need to get women equal pay for equal work. So
yeah. It's like we've had the Equal Pay Act since 1963. I mean, this is not what is happening. So
yeah. Like, this discrimination would be illegal. Of course, it's already illegal.
Yeah,
under the Civil Rights Act.
We can't make it more illegal. Like, it's either illegal or it isn't. It's a binary. That's it. So what about? As another topic I've covered a little bit, but what we hear about rape statistics on campus. Now, we don't want to make light of this because no doubt women are at times victimized on campus, but there's something kind of off about this. There's and it's twofold. It's the numbers, and and we should talk about this one too. The believe all women thing. Now, I'm sure a lot of women are trustworthy, right? I have no reason to doubt that, but I don't ever say believe just on the basis of the person's biological characteristics.
Believe this group. Believe an entire huge demographic group.
Something seems wrong with that. But also the figures saying that something like 25% of women are actually raped on campus. I mean, that would be, if that were true, like, there would be a revolt. I mean, no father would send his daughter to school ever. Like, who would?
Yeah, if you believe these statistics, you better not send your.
No, you're crazy. So, what's the truth of this?
So we don't in fact know what the actual statistic is, right? But the 1 in 4 is not credible, right? It implies that, so that the claim is like, by the time you graduate from college, you have a 25% chance of being raped. And that would mean that American college campuses are more dangerous to women than Detroit, which is the most crime-ridden city in the country. And so how could that be? Like, are we recruiting college students from the nation's prisons? There are a bunch of tricks that people did to sort of inflate the numbers. Right. So, one thing is, they did this survey, where there's just like some very small percentage of people who said that they'd been raped in the course of like 7 months. And then on the basis of that, they tried to extrapolate to how many would have been raped during an entire college career. Okay. But for the purpose of making that extrapolation, so one thing is they assumed the college career would be 5 years. And the longer you assume it is, the higher the statistic comes out, right? Okay, so they assumed it would be 5 years, but that's not correct. The average is 4.33 years. Okay, and then another thing is, well, they counted the summer months, but people are usually not in school during the summer months, right? And so, like, you probably shouldn't count those. Okay, and then, like, another thing is, well, there's like a slight mathematical error, which is that they just multiply. They just multiplied the statistic for the, whatever it was, 7 months by 5 years over 7 months. But that's not really the correct probability calculation. Okay, you make a bunch of corrections like this, and you get it from 24% down to 9%. Okay, and then another thing that was interesting, though, was that some of the people who are counted as rape victims with themselves say that they were not raped. Right, like. Okay. So the study authors asked them a bunch of questions, and then the people running the study from the answers to the questions, oh, that person's raped. But then they also asked, and would you describe what happened to you as rape? And then half of the quote rape victims say no. Okay, so if you correct for that, then the statistic goes from 9% down to like 4%.
Well, in that case, I guess you should believe those women if they say it.
Yeah, might take that. And then another thing is like, well, you actually get different results from different surveys. Okay, so like there are other surveys where you get basically an order of magnitude less. So you get like estimates of 1%. And so it's not entirely clear what's going on when you get such widely varying estimates, right? But by the way, like these all involve small numbers of respondents, right? Like you ask a whole bunch of people this question, and only a tiny number of people give you an affirmative answer. And so, and when that's the case, then you multiply that number, right? But that methodology is very sensitive to error. Like a very small rate of people giving incorrect answers could result in a big error in your final conclusion.
Well, what about this more fundamental claim about, quote, believe all women? And one of the reasons we should believe them is that in general, we find that they lie about sexual assault only about 2% of the time. And then there's a range, but it's generally single-digit percentage of the time. So overwhelming likelihood is that the woman is telling you the truth. So what's wrong with that?
Yeah. I've heard the statistic quoted that women only lie 2 to 10% of the time about rape and sexual assault, right? And then as I was hearing that statistic, I was like, I wonder how they would know that. So, right? So you have these cases where woman accuses a man of rape and the man denies it. How would the study authors know whether the woman was lying or not? Do they have a crystal ball by which they can tell what really happened? Okay, so I looked up some of these studies, and I looked up the article from which the 2 to 10% figure comes. And by the way, in the article, it's 2 to 10.9, and then people round that down to 10, right? That's a minor error, but 10.9 should be rounded to 11. Okay, but It's just emblematic of the sort of thing that the activists do. They just make any. Okay, so anyway, I look at the article that statistic is from, and what happened was, well, by false report, what they actually meant was proven to be false, and the majority of cases were never proven either way. So for the majority of reports, like the cops never found out what actually happened. And so, like, those don't count. Like, those count as non-false reports. And so what they're actually quoting is the percentage of the time that there's super compelling evidence that she was lying. Okay, but if you, you can't assume that the rest of the time it was true. Like, you can't assume that all of the unknown cases were true, right? And so, that's the main thing that was going wrong there.
So there's just something wrong with this whole approach to begin with, because as you say, how did you arrive at this number?
Yeah. And, every time you hear a statistic, you can ask yourself, how would somebody know that? You can't just assume that the statistic is true. What that means is that somebody wrote a paper in which they claimed that was the answer, and then you have to wonder, what was their methodology? What was their argument for that being the answer, right?
Now, in this book, you go on, you have myths pertaining to science, myths pertaining to economics, because you're talking about regulations and taxes and generational wealth. And they're all important, but they all point in, as you say, there's something they have in common. Like I just had, do you know Andrew Heaton by any chance?
No.
Oh, well, you guys would get along well. And he had a book on tribalism. And of course, tribalism helps to account for why some people persist in believing things that are false, because they feel like their tribal allegiance demands it of them. My people believe X about the world. And so as we look at the different chapters in your book, you mentioned that, of course, they cover a wide variety of topics, and yet they're not entirely random. So what is the story? So the story that these myths basically tell, as you say, is one that is very unflattering to the United States as a society. Even so, though, there's a myth about, You have a myth about the effectiveness of mask wearing. You have myths pertaining to climate change. And there, the connection is a little more tenuous between the worldview that the myth is promoting and the idea that the United States is a bad place. Is there a bigger theme that might somehow connect these disparate things?
Oh, well, I mean, so first, of course, it goes beyond the United States. It's more like an attack on Western civilization. Now, the mask thing is not that closely connected to that. I think the reason why masks became politicized, it was partly because President Trump refused to wear a mask. And so then at that point, the people who hated him decided that masks were crucial. Everybody needs to wear them. Right? It was, okay. So that was just sort of an accident. If the Republican president had been a mask fanatic, then people might have, had the opposite view. The global warming thing, though, is connected to the attack on Western civilization, right? Because it's basically, people are saying, well, the pollution is mostly from the Western advanced industrialized societies.
Yeah.
And so those societies are killing everyone,
Even though those societies are producing almost all the goods everybody else uses. The production percentage from these countries is just huge. Yeah, we use a lot of energy because we produce things.
Yeah, I mean, these days, there's like more being produced in China and more pollution, right? They use all these coal power plants. But anyway, people in the West mainly care about attacking ourselves, right? But anyway, the reason why there's more pollution coming out of the West is we have higher, we consume more because we're rich. We're rich because we have a society that works. It's not like we're not rich because we're evil. Like the poor countries are not poor because they're environmentalists, right? They're poor because they can't produce more because their system is a failure.
Right. Yeah, that is it. So the problem is what everybody expects of a book author is that at the end, you'll have a neat little potted solution for us. But I think in this case, the only solution there is just spreading the truth the best you can. Even if it seems like you're up against insurmountable odds. I don't know that there is a quote unquote solution to this.
Yeah. Yeah. There's been, there's just a certain amount of propaganda going around, and there's like propaganda in the schools. And I can detect this from the college students, right? Because I think the college students are coming in pre-propagandized. They're going to get more propaganda while they're in college, but they've already got some. So,
yeah.
I taught about, I covered the issue of global warming in a class. And then, I just talked about how, there are various global problems and global warming might not be the top priority. And, talked about Bjorn Lomborg's research on this. Just that it's not the most cost-effective thing to focus our resources on. Okay, and then, like a bunch of students were like, but if global warming kills everyone, then it has to be our top priority because it's going to kill literally everyone.
Yeah, and you what? Even you won't find any, quote unquote, scientist actually saying that. So they made that up in their heads. Like even they wouldn't say like William Nordhaus, who I think got the Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
Like William Nordhaus even said, I mean, look, you look at them themselves, even they typically don't go that far.
Well, so the actual serious scholars are saying things like, so Nordhaus says, there's probably going to be a decline of 2% of world GDP by the year 2100. That's the problem we're worried about, okay? Or the IPCC, which is like the authority on climate change, if anyone is, like they're saying, there's probably going to be a ocean level rise by 0.4 to 0.8 meters by 2100 AD. Okay, so that's the sort of thing that the actual experts are worried about, but it's these political activists like Greta Thunberg who are saying, the world is going to come to an end. Like, how do you look at this? How do you look at this, scientific report and conclude everyone is going to die? How is everyone going to die from a 2-foot rise in sea level? Right?
Yeah.
And then, when you look at the IPCC's report of their estimate of how many people are going to die from global warming, they were like, maybe 250,000 people a year by mid-century. And that's going to be 0.25% of the total death rate. The idea that this is an existential risk is totally from political activism.
Or that, I mean, unless you're going to tell me that up till recently, by some amazing coincidence, we had the optimal temperature such that if we divert from it in any way, catastrophe strikes, that would be, I hope all these people are religious believers, because the likelihood of that is zero. Like that God had to have done that.
Yeah.
So then,
you might think.
Like there have to be pros and cons, right? There have to be some good, right? There's probably a little good that comes from a warmer planet, right? I mean, I'm not even trying to be facetious. There would have to be.
No, that's right. And, I talked to the economist David Friedman, and, he was not convinced that the costs of global warming are overall outweighing the benefits. Like, he thought we don't even know whether the total effect is positive or negative, because most of the estimates of the harms of global warming, they only look at the harms and they don't look at benefits. So it's like, okay, well, more people are going to die from heat. Like every year, some people die from heat strokes. There's going to be more of that, as the planet warms up. But, some people also die of cold. And actually, many more people die from cold than heat, like multiple times more.
Yeah.
So those will go down. So the overall death rate might go down. It's not really obvious. And, there's some areas where it'll become too hot to grow crops, where it's currently fine, but it'll become too hot. But then there are other areas where it's currently too cold to grow crops, and it'll become suitable, right? So you got kind of, it's right. You know how human civilization started. You know why the human species existed for 200,000 years and didn't have civilization, and then suddenly, there were several thousand years ago, they started. Well, it's probably because of the end of the ice age, right? So, one way of putting it is global warming started human civilization, right? Not man-made global warming, natural warming.
Right.
This is just illustrating the point that it's not necessarily worse to change the climate. Sometimes it gets better.
Let me ask you one more question. This is more of a personal, or maybe it's a professional question, but academia, I think itself has probably, which has always, at least in our lifetime, has been on the left, has marched ever more so, I think, in the past 5-10 years. So do you just not care about popularity at all? Does this just not faze you?
Well, I don't know. I started doing, radical libertarian stuff a long time ago. So my political orientation is well known by now. There's not really anything to lose at this point. And also, I've been putting controversial stuff on my blog for many years. Philosophers are less, I would say, less doctrinaire than people in the other humanities and social sciences. So, philosophers kind of like you if you have good arguments, or if you're good at arguing.
Okay.
And the tradition in philosophy is, if you don't like what somebody says, that's an invitation to argue with them and explain why they're wrong. And the tradition in some other areas is, if you don't like what somebody says, that's the time to start shouting at them and trying to ruin their personal life. Not to say that there aren't any philosophers who are assholes. There are some. That happens sometimes. At least most of them. Most of them are intellectual.
Do you go to the professional meetings?
I don't go to a lot of conferences. Occasionally I go to a conference, and occasionally I go somewhere that somebody invites me to speak.
Okay. All right. Because I was just wondering if you went to, the APA or something, and people are standing around saying, "Oh, geez, here comes Huemer." Pretend we don't see him.
Yeah. Well, they don't do that.
Okay.
They don't do that in a way that I would notice.
Okay.
Maybe there are
Good.
people who are avoiding me, but I'm not noticing that. Actually, yeah, if I go to a conference, people recognize me. And usually the people who will come and talk to you are the people who like you and like your work.
Yeah. Oh,
so
that's
there
true.
There might be a bunch of people who hate me, but they're not going to talk to me.
They don't come up to you. That's right. I mean, that's one interesting thing I've learned from Gene Epstein, who hosts debates in New York City, is that he'll approach people who have criticized somebody in print. and say, all right, well, you want to debate him? And they'll say no. I said, no, look, I'll give you this much money. No. What do you say?
I wouldn't want to platform the bad people.
Yeah, that's the usual excuse. But the funny thing is, when Gene offers them enough money, somehow all those moral scruples go right out the window. Okay, I'll debate now. I'll platform that bad guy now. So anyway, all right, the book is Progressive Myths. I'll link to it at tomwoods.com/2260. Also in the description of the video. It's Mike Huemer, Huemer, and the book has a title that is very, very easy to remember, and you can see the book cover on the screen as he holds it up for you. So, Mike, thanks so much for your time and for this book.
Thanks. It's been great talking to you, Tom. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. And then also a quick announcement for any of my New Orleans and Dallas people. I have murder mystery dinner parties coming up in those cities, and I would like to see you there. So check out woodsmystery.com for the details, and I'll be adding more cities soon. So go over there and sign up for my notification list so you can do this fun thing with me someday. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.